Hi, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to the Center for American Progress. We're going to get started in about 5 minutes, so we just ask that you silence your cell phones before we do. At the conclusion of the program, there's going to be a question and answer period, so we ask that before you state your question, you state your name and affiliation before asking your brief question. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Neera Tandon, and I'm president of the Center for American Progress, and I'm thrilled to welcome all of you here today. Later this week, the eyes of the international community will turn towards Hanoi, Vietnam, where Donald Trump and Kim Jong Un will meet for the second time. And while their first summit produced a host of sweeping promises from both sides, we've seen little concrete action take place during the 37 weeks which have followed. Trump has claimed that North Korea no longer poses a nuclear threat to the United States, but his own director of national intelligence has testified that the Kim regime is still unlikely to relinquish its stock of weapons. So it is clear that any further negotiations will require the president to engage in thoughtful deliberations and real diplomacy, not the reality TV antics that so often he falls back upon. We will see which path he chooses to follow. I think we can all agree that the future of North Korea represents a critical challenge in maintaining our peace and security, not just for every single American, but for people throughout Asia and the whole world. Later in our program, we will have the opportunity to hear from a panel of experts who fully understand the complex and delicate nature of North Korea's relationship with the United States and our allies in the region. But first, I have the pleasure of introducing someone who is leading the charge to demand greater accountability and transparency from President Trump's foreign policies, Congressman Eliot Engel of New York. As chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Congressman Engel is responsible for tackling a wide range of vital issues, from investigating the death of journalist Jamal Khashoggi to uncovering the full details of the conversations with Vladimir Putin, Trump's conversations with Vladimir Putin. I want to be clear who I'm talking about, and enacting sanctions against authoritarian rulers in nations such as Syria and Venezuela. Over the course of his career, Congressman Engel has established a distinguished record of advancing equality and human rights throughout the globe. And last Thursday, he joined the chairman of two other House committees with jurisdiction over America's national security in calling for Trump to stop withholding important information on the administration's ongoing talks with North Korea. We're so grateful he could join us this afternoon to discuss his views on America's policy toward North Korea moving forward. So please help give me a warm round of applause for Representative and Chairman Eliot Engel.
I looked at my speech and I said, my God, it's so much to say, and then I realized there were 3 copies. So it isn't as long as I thought. So thank you, Neera, for these kind words, and thank you for your leadership. It's just been outstanding at a very important time. And thanks for the lovely introduction. I always like to say that when someone gives me such a wonderful introduction as you just gave me, I wish a couple of the women in my life would be here to hear it. My mother, my late mother, and my wife. My mother would have believed every wonderful, charming thing you said about me, and my wife would have wondered who you were talking about. So let me thank you thank the Center for American Progress for hosting us today, and let me thank also Kelly Magzamin and Mike Fuchs for their hard work in putting this together. I'm grateful to everyone here for your engagement and your contribution to the policy issues that affect all aspects of American life. We're so fortunate to have CAP to help ensure that progressive policy ideas are developed and discussed and brought to the attention of lawmakers and officials across government. And I certainly value your work on foreign policy. You know, I have always loved foreign policy. To me, it's just people were reading fictional novels and I was reading foreign policy. That's how I was growing up. Progressive policy ideas are very important, and that's what you do here, develop them, discuss them, and brought it to the attention of lawmakers across government. And I value your work on foreign policy, and my staff and I will continue to look to you for good ideas and creative approaches as the Foreign Affairs Committee gets to work in the 116th Congress. And of course, grappling with the challenge posed by North Korea and this administration's policy towards that country will be at the top of the list. People think I'm some kind of a North Korea expert because I've been to Pyongyang twice, but actually that doesn't really make you an expert. It's still a mystifying area, mystifying place, mystifying mood. In the Washington echo chamber, everyone seems to be a North Korea expert these days. I will not make that claim, but fortunately the panel you'll hear after me, I'm told, is made up of real experts. So rather than tell you all what you probably already know, what I'd like to do instead this afternoon is to give you a Capitol Hill perspective on North Korea. How does Congress, particularly the new Democratic House, view the President's approach? What are the opportunities and pitfalls? And how will we, as a co-equal branch of government, I've said that so many times in these first few weeks, co-equal branch of government, play a role in shaping our policy towards Pyongyang? My first point, I think, is pretty obvious, but needs to be said. Members of Congress, on both sides of the aisle, want peace and stability on the Korean peninsula. We want to see diplomacy succeed. Democrats aren't going to stand in the way of a real opportunity just because it happens to come from an administration and a president with whom we deeply disagree on so many things. We fully understand that any conflict on the Korean peninsula will likely cost millions of lives, and we also understand what's at stake for the people of North Korea and South Korea. I visited North Korea twice, as I mentioned. I've witnessed what a bleak place it is. It's sort of stepping backwards in time into, the way I described it was 1953 East Berlin. That's kind of the feeling you got there. Suffering that people endure every day there. I've seen no evidence to suggest that the regime's gross human rights abuses have changed in any way. And here in the United States, I've met with Korean Americans, many of my own constituents and others from New York, longing to be reunited with loved ones confined in the North. This month, the Foreign Affairs Committee hosted Speaker Moon of the South Korean National Assembly. He impressed on our members the importance of keeping an open mind when it comes to a potential process for reducing risks on the peninsula. I took that message to heart because the status quo isn't acceptable. It's not acceptable. And if this administration, or any administration, puts forth a transparent and credible policy to move things in a positive direction, Congress should take it seriously and act as a helpful partner. Broadly speaking, what could constitute such a deal? First of all, it's essential to have a baseline assessment of North Korea's existing capabilities. If North Korea declared this information in a credible way, it would send a strong signal about their intent and sincerity. We would also know, as negotiations move forward, whether we were making progress towards capping and rolling back those capabilities. I authored legislation that requires that assessment that was part of last year's defense authorization. And of course, anything North Korea offers us would have to be subject to stringent scrutiny and verification every step of the way. North Korea has put certain facilities on the table as an offer for sanctions relief. None of that means anything without a rigorous inspections regime and assurances that the North Koreans cannot restart their programs outside the scope of an agreement or sometime in the future. The devil would be in the details, but if the administration brings us a deal that satisfies those requirements, it will get a fair hearing. That's my commitment. But so far, what we've gotten from the administration has not been credible, and it certainly has not been transparent. President Trump declared in Singapore last year that North Korea no longer posed a threat. But as far as I can tell, there's been no fundamental improvement into the security of America or of our allies. Mixed messages from the President and his top advisors have muddled our strategy and undermined our negotiation position. We've heard the Secretary of State suggest negotiating North Korea without preconditions because they have nuclear weapons. What message does that send to Iran and others around the world? What will be the next country to race towards the bomb because they think the United States wants to bargain on more favorable terms. When the stakes are as high as they are in this case, this sort of talk, this lack of clarity and direction, in my opinion, is downright dangerous. So while Congress will be constructive if this process takes a positive turn, we also have a responsibility to speak up and act if we think things are being mishandled. This is one of my top priorities as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. For years, under administrations of both parties, Congress has essentially handed the executive branch the keys to all our foreign policy vehicles. Well, I think that's gone on too long. Congress is a co-equal branch of government. Nancy Pelosi likes to say we're in the very beginning of the Constitution, and we are not second fiddle to anybody. So we're a co-equal branch of government, and it's time that we exercise our prerogatives. So what will that look like when it comes to North Korea? Well, we do have legislative tools at our disposal, and even with divided government and the slim chance that major legislation could make it across the finish line in both the House and the Senate, legislating lays down markers. It establishes what we view as a correct alternative to flawed policies, and it sends an incredibly important message to those paying attention. To begin with, I take the views of all of our alliance partners, including Japan, very seriously. America is best able to tackle tough challenges by collaborating with our closest friends. The only way we're going to move the needle is by working from a position of unity with our allies. This administration, on the other hand, has sunk into a pattern of skepticism and even antagonism about the value of America's alliances. I just came back from Europe, and that was really evident coming back from Munich and Brussels. It was really just evident, meeting with the EU and meeting with the heads of other countries. When the president chides NATO allies for not paying their fair share or threatens to leave the alliance, paying their fair share I think is important, but threatening to leave the alliance, you can bet that leaders in Tokyo and Seoul are getting heartburn. What if the United States decides to walk away from its security commitments in Asia? The president has certainly toyed with the idea of drawing down the American troop presence on the Korean peninsula, which Congress has pushed back on in a bipartisan way. And of course, our friends in Taiwan will see what we're doing and know how it will absolutely affect them as well. It's important for Congress to show that we don't agree with the administration's handling of our alliances, and that's why I introduced legislation, along with other Democrats and Republicans in the House and Senate, emphasizing the importance of the United States, Japan, South Korea trilateral cooperation. This relationship is important for so many reasons, but especially so because of where we are with North Korea. Where I think Congress, and the House in particular, has its biggest role to play is in conducting rigorous oversight on all matters pertaining to North Korea. This should have been happening all along. Oversight is another one of Congress's constitutional responsibilities. But up until now, the administration, and all administrations, have gotten away with remaining largely silent about its policies, its implementation plans, and what North Korea has actually agreed to do. Since the Singapore summit, the Secretary of State has not briefed members of our committee on the talks with North Korea. They have ignored that requirement I talked about before, requiring a report to Congress on North Korea's capabilities, which we need as a baseline to measure progress or lack thereof. They've even cut members of Congress off from intelligence material related to North Korea, information to which we have had access for years. As far as I'm concerned as the new chairman, it's simply unacceptable. So last week I joined the chairman of the Armed Services and Intelligence Committees, my colleagues Adam Smith and Adam Schiff, to say that enough is enough. The administration may have gotten away with circumventing Congress with the Republican majority in the House, but we, as a new Democratic majority, simply will not stand for it. Going forward, we're going to demand answers and the kind of transparency that the American people want. The purpose of transparency isn't just to make the Congress feel good. It is to ensure that the United States is pursuing realistic and effective policies. We all want the same solution, a North Korea that no longer has nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction or the means to make them, and a country that won't threaten its neighbors. But Congress and the American people cannot rely on a simple declaration from the President and the North Koreans that the problem is fixed. We need a candid and realistic assessment of where things stand, both going into and coming out of the upcoming summit. We need concrete and verifiable commitments and a credible process. We need to know that North Korea is holding up its end of any potential bargain, whether that's capping fissile material production, rolling back certain capabilities, opening key facilities to international inspectors, or increasing transparency about their weapons infrastructure, and we need a chance to have our concerns and questions fully addressed. The Obama administration briefed Congress fully and often on Iran, and this administration needs to do the same for North Korea. One of my biggest concerns has to do with the sequencing of sanctions relief. In recent years, my former colleague and my predecessor as chairman, Ed Royce, and I pushed through 2 North Korea sanctions bills that made it to the president's desk. These laws, along with executive action, have built a diverse sanctions regime going after a range of North Korean and bad behavior, from nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles to human rights abuses and cyber attacks. These sanctions make it somewhat harder for North Korea to engage in its dangerous and illegal activities. But I believe that sanctions are a policy tool, not an end in of itself. We use sanctions to push for changes in behavior, and we need to be open to altering our sanctions if that behavior really changes. We shouldn't lift sanctions as a response to hollow concessions or empty gestures or promises of future reforms or promises of things that will change even though we don't really believe it. We've heard it from the North Koreans again and again. Empty gestures may be enough for this president, but they won't fool me. So as part of the Foreign Affairs Committee's oversight role, I'll be keeping a close eye on what happens after this summit. Sanctions imposed for human rights abuses or an illegal nuclear program should not be eased in response to, say, a political declaration of a cessation of hostilities or offers of economic integration. If the North Koreans want human rights sanctions lifted, there needs to be real progress on human rights. If the North Koreans want nuclear sanctions lifted, there needs to be real progress on denuclearization, move for move. And if I sense that the administration is jeopardizing our security or that of our allies in order to claim victory or signal progress, I guarantee you that the officials responsible will be explaining why before our committee. So let me close by saying that as Congress and the Foreign Affairs Committee press for these answers, we need to be able to look to all of you for your guidance and expertise. And you know well, this is one of the most intractable foreign policy challenges that we face. We're all rooting for success. And again, if the President is able to pull it off, I'll be the first one to say, well done, Mr. President. But our role must be to bring a realistic view and a healthy dose of skepticism when the President takes another victory lap. Working together, I'm confident that we'll hold the administration accountable while at the same time amplifying the ideas that we think would result in real progress. So I look forward to our ongoing partnership, and I thank all of you for your commitment. Thank you so much. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, and it's good afternoon to everybody. My name is Mike Fuchs. I am a senior fellow here with the Center for American Progress. Very pleased again to welcome you here to the center for this very timely discussion that we have this morning. We've had a very obviously interesting, I think, discussion and speech by the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Representative Engel, and I think we'll dive into some of those questions right here. But we have a really distinguished panel that will help us broaden this out as well and get some perspectives from the region as well as Washington. And so to my right is Tai Mibaye, who is a fellow at the Atlantic Council. To his right, Sujin Park, who is a public policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And to her right, Jung Park, who is a senior fellow at Brookings Institution. And all three have years and years of experience dealing with North Korea and dealing with these issues. And so I thought that we could just jump right in here. So to start, Chairman Engel, I think, hit the nail on the head in his opening, where he sort of said that there's widespread bipartisan support in Washington for diplomacy with North Korea. But they want to see actual progress here. And I think that one of the real questions in my mind is what we are seeing over the last year real diplomacy with North Korea? Or is this more of a show from the president and perhaps both sides? And so I thought I'd start maybe, Jung, with you and move this way to get our thoughts on sort of what's gotten us to Hanoi.
I sat here so I wouldn't be the first to react. Anyway, I think a lot of it is show, but I think, when we look back on what's happened since 2017, it's in stark contrast to what was happening between 2011 when Kim Jong Un first came to power and 2017, where the bulk of his external exchanges were with Dennis Rodman, the basketball player, and Kenji Fujimoto, a pseudonym for the sushi chef who used to work for the Kim family. So when you put that into this context, of course, the fact that Kim is now engaging, doing maximum engagement with the outside world is noteworthy. And I think, when we look back on some of the things that has happened since Kim pivoted, he started talking about denuclearization. I mean, I think you can argue about what he's actually committed to, but at least he's starting to talk about it. And he's so we're starting to see more of what he's like and what his preferences might be. So he's made some. Kim has made some comments about he's destroyed, so he says, the nuclear test site. He has started but then stopped dismantling the missile engine test site, and he's making some comments about the Yongbyon nuclear research site, depending on U.S. corresponding measures. So I think that gives the sense that there is big opportunities here, but there are also risks that this is just another part of Pyongyang's playbook to try to extract political and economic concessions, and I think we have to play that pretty carefully.
I think that despite some concerns for too much of pomp and circumstance, I do think that diplomacy has begun, considering all these things that Jung has already mentioned, that there has been fire and fury and talk of war, etc., prior to this diplomacy beginning just about a year ago. So I think that diplomacy has begun in earnest, but what we have to make sure at this point, after the first summit in Singapore, is when they were able to set the goals, very basic pillars of where we should be heading. But now it's a critical juncture where we have to make sure that we flesh it out with real actions to be taken and to be verified to move this diplomacy ahead in earnest. So I do think that diplomacy has begun, but it's our responsibility and also to make sure that diplomacy moves ahead, albeit slowly, because we know that this cannot be taken care of in a few months or a few years.
Right.
Yes, thank you very much. And first of all, I always feel a little bit awkward that I have to say this disclaimer that although I institutionally belong to the Embassy of Japan as a minister, but today I'm here as a fellow of the Atlantic Council. And while I speak today, in no way represent the views of the government or the Embassy of Japan. And I talk today based on open source information and my own experience. So not on any kind of classified information. Probably let me say that Japan is the most cautious stakeholders with regard to the possible outcome of the second Trump-Kim summit meeting in Hanoi. And my sense is that in Japan, people rather than hoping something good to happen, they hope something bad not to happen. And they don't expect anything of North Korea, but what they want President Trump is not to give North Korea what he should not, rather than getting what he should. And then what is good and what is bad? This we can consider in two ways, absolute term and relative term. And the first relative term means that comparison, between what is given to North Korea and what we get from North Korea. I do not assume that the government of Japan has already made its own clear criteria, in this regard. However, for example, if Mr. Trump promises to lift all UN Security Council resolution sanctions in exchange only for North Korea's dismantling nuclear facilities in Yongbyon and the return of IAEA inspectors, probably Japan would think the reward is too much. And although I don't think this deal is going to happen. And the absolute term, this is my guess, but probably people in Tokyo, in Japan, think that this is something related to alliance. So, people do not want to see any alliance-related things that could be included in the category to be given to North Korea. For example, U.S. military presence, not only in South Korea, but also in Japan and in the region, or in the provision of extended deterrence, which means nuclear umbrella. So probably, people in Japan are now taking a close look at, if or not, Mr. Trump is giving these things, to North Korea.
Well, so it's interesting, right? So you describe the Japanese people as probably being unhappy if the president actually makes success or get what he wants. I know, but
it depends on
of course, on
what the deal is made there. Yeah.
Representative Engel obviously was talking about how at the beginning Democrats are not going to stand in the way of the president. Obviously, they support diplomacy, but there's obviously, I think, a range of views here in Washington. Sujin, I'm curious for your thoughts on the posture of the current government in Seoul. President Moon obviously has been out there in front from day one last year, really pushing forward on the diplomacy, and really obviously wants to see the U.S. North Korea diplomacy succeed. So, how do you think that they're viewing this summit?
Well, a lot is at stake at the second summit between President Trump and Chairman Kim. As you just mentioned, President Moon of South Korea has been the initiator, so to speak, of this rapprochement, and also the facilitator and encourager from both sides to engage with each other and to go on this path of diplomacy to seek if the denuclearization is possible. So I think that they're watching with a lot of hope and also some jitters as what might happen during the summit, as we witnessed in the first one in Singapore, where we saw that some unexpected outcomes were, there. But I think the basic approach is that in order to denuclearize North Korea, another factor has to be established, which is peace, and peace that should go in parallel with denuclearization, because given the history of the past quarter century of engaging with North Korea, trying to denuclearize North Korea did not result in where we want it to be. So the logic, from what I understand, is that in order for the denuclearization process to move forward, it has to be done in tandem with progress on peace talks to allow for North Korea to take steps toward denuclearization. So I think the goal here is to have these two processes go in tandem. Well, although it's not easy, it is mandatory. It's really necessary if we are to see it move forward at all. Otherwise, it will just be a repeat. Without a peace process going in side by side or in tandem, it'll likely be the repeat of what happened before.
So, when we're talking about this process and this diplomacy, right, it's really hard, at least in my mind, to divorce it from the personalities who are engaged in it, right? President Trump and Kim Jong Un are both, shall we say, colorful and interesting and unique personalities in their own rights and in their own different ways. Jung, having watched different rounds of diplomacy, over the years between the two countries. There is an argument out there that this summit approach, the first time that it's really been taken this way, could unlock new kinds of progress, and that it's worth giving this type of diplomacy with regular summits a shot. What do you think about that?
Right. I think meeting with Kim Jong Un at the presidential level, I think it's not inherently wrong, and it's not inherently a bad way of approaching North Korea policy. In this highly authoritarian regime, it makes sense to go direct to the top and talk to Kim. North Korea's diplomats, as I'm sure my esteemed panelists know, they're not they're just implementers of policy. They don't have independent. They're not independently empowered to negotiate. So, given Kim Jong Un's ownership of the nuclear weapons program and given the authoritarian regime, it makes sense to go to talk leader to leader. The problem is when when the president is going into this room without having the benefit of preparation or having a clear understanding of what's at stake, including the history of negotiations, what Kim Jong Un might be looking for, what are some of the pitfalls and the potential risks, and also how we should manage these types of meetings with Kim, having the power of the alliances and our partnerships with us. So when the president goes into the room with Kim Jong Un, it should not just be the person of the president, but that he would get more credibility if he had the power of the allies, other stakeholders in the region, Congress, as well as his own national security apparatus, including the intelligence community. I think that would provide the president with more credibility with Kim, and also provide incentives for Kim to actually make tangible progress on denuclearization.
I'm curious for your thoughts, Tai and Sujin, on this. I mean, yesterday, I think it was yesterday, in the last couple of days, the president said basically, as long as Kim Jong Un is not testing, he's happy. So if the current process that the president is interested in is basically he'll do summit meetings with Kim Jong Un to push this forward as long as Kim Jong Un is not testing, is that worthwhile? Is that a proposition that's worthwhile in trying to test the diplomacy?
I think continuing diplomacy is necessary and is worthwhile, but I think just meeting for the sake of meeting is not what's expected here, and we really need to move forward with tangible actions to be verified and to be going forward. So I think set aside what President Trump said, testing is enough. I think that's a good start, but now we need to move on. We need to go beyond the start line and to actually, albeit small, we do need to see significant actions from North Korea that's substantive, that indicates that North Korea, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, in a month or two, but is willing to go down that path with some acknowledgeable actions that are verifiable. For instance, freezing its fissile material, production of fissile material, and also weapons production, which actually Chairman Kim pledged in his New Year's address. So I think it's important that we codify it rather than having Kim say that I'm just going to do it. So I think it's very important. We will have to see what comes out of this summit, but to codify some of the very basic starters to move this forward is very critical.
Think about the summit, the leader-to-leader diplomacy, Tai.
First of all, I agree with John to say that having a summit meeting itself is not inherently bad, and particularly with the regime of North Korea that must be very authoritarian, outreaching to that the top political leader should have its own significance, and the nuclear test and stopping it is its own utility, because people almost forgot that, but. Stopping the nuclear test is bad, not because it makes us busy, but because it increases the credibility of North Korea's nuclear capability. So not making the North Korea not to do the test itself, its own utility. And probably the next step should be to cap, as the chairman also argued, that the North Korea's production of fissile materials and nuclear weapons and even missiles, because what's changing now, even at this moment, is that North Korea is still consistently producing their producing nuclear materials and weapons and missiles. So this is the many experts are worried about, and those of the many of them that insist a sort of a capping theory. It is not very realistic to demand North Korea to do everything all at once. So first start with the capping. So the question is that what we are giving to North Korea in exchange for that, because we need to impress North Korea that they still have a lot to do. As Mr. Began said in his statement at the Stanford University, the more. So this is a very, very tricky stuff. We need a deep consideration, but what we give needs to be sufficiently insufficient to impress North Korea that they still have a lot to do. And this is why people are very concerned about what is given to North Korea in exchange with what we are getting.
Well, so I'd like to dig down on that a little bit deeper, right? We always talk about the need for concrete, verifiable, tangible, name your, fill in the blank word, type of progress with North Korea to know that they're actually mean what they say. Yongbyon, the idea of freezing, stopping production of fissile material at Yongbyon is something that Kim Jong Un put on the table, it seems, back in September at the last inter-Korean summit. What do you all think about that as a proposal? He said that they would potentially consider doing it in exchange for corresponding measures left to be determined by the United States. But do you think that the closing or the freezing of production facilities at Yongbyon would be a significant and tangible enough step forward? And if so, what kinds of things do you think the United States should be willing to do in return? And Jung, I can throw it over to you to start maybe.
It depends, right? Because Yongbyon has 390 facilities over a couple of square miles. So they could either be selling us Windows 97 and telling us it's the most recent thing, or they're selling us the Samsung phone that opens, right? Which is
not the one that blows up in your face.
Not the one that blows up, but the one that opens into a full-scale tablet, which is really cool. But so they can give us that reactor or the other reactor. So it depends on what exactly we're talking about at Yongbyon. I think if Kim were to allow inspectors into Yongbyon, then that would be a big plus for me. And it would be a big signpost from my perspective of Kim's sincerity. We've been hearing since the summitry started that Kim is sincere and he really wants this to happen, and that he's committed to denuclearization. So if he actually allowed inspectors in to all the facilities, or the most important facilities, and not just the research classroom, right? That would be significant for me.
I actually would agree with Chung on that. Although there are some concerns that North Korea might not open up the real important, more up-to-date present facilities, I think having inspectors on the ground to inspect and also eventually verify, starting with Yongbyon would be a good start, because we can't go in and do everything all at once. And because Yongbyon is at the heart of North Korea's nuclear weapons development, I think it's a good start. And also because North Korea set it up front that they're willing to close it down, given the right countermeasure. The word is not coming to me.
Right.
The
corresponding measures.
Yeah, corresponding measures, right. So I think, and the question, of course, again, is the corresponding measures. But I think although we kind of sometimes bypass the need for authoritarian leaders or dictators to address their public because they are dictators. They can do whatever they want. It is true compared to our leaders in democracies, but they also need to address their public, their audience, to justify or legitimize their changed behavior or shifts in policy. So I think although we have yet to find out if Kim Jong Un has really made the shift or strategic shift to denuclearize, I think we also need to test him and also give him some room to work in to address his audience, to justify his moves, if indeed that is true. So if he actually can and will close down Yongbyon, he has to address his public. I'm doing this because we're getting something from U.S. And I think North Korea would be most interested in sanctions relief. That's what they're aiming for because that's what's most hurting. But because sanctions relief is hard to get at this point, I think maybe declaration of the end of war, the Korean War, some people call it peace declaration, that is not legally binding. And I don't think we should confuse with the peace treaty that is legally binding, needs all the other signatories, but just the political declaration that the war is over and we're no longer fighting. I think that political declaration would also be useful for Kim Jong Un to speak to his audience that, because we're now coming to an end of a war, we can do this. So I think something to that extent would be useful and plausible.
Well, Ty, your thoughts on Yongbyon, and also actually I wanted to throw in there a second question on top of it, which is the peace declaration. This is the other thing I think we've heard a lot of rumors about, that maybe this is something that comes out of the Hanoi summit, and so your thoughts?
The first about Yongbyon, what is a significant progress? The significance is some sort of a subjective word. So it depends on what your priority is, what you want. It depends on what you want. And if you argue that dismantling the Yongbyon facilities and let IA inspectors see these facilities as significant, I would like to remind you that with the agreed framework in 1994, they have already stopped the operation of the Yongbyon facilities. With the 2005 six-party talks joint statement, disabled the facilities in Yongbyon, and even with the very quickly scrapped the agreement, 2011, North Korea, agreed, the same formula just in exchange with, nutrition, assistance. This time the President of the United States is going to Hanoi to meet with his North Korean counterpart. Do you expect that same outcome, that you saw with the agreed framework, six-party talks, and reap the agreement, probably the uranium enrichment facility, which was not included in the previous agreement, that could be a part of the deal this time. So this could be a significant, and a scrap of nuclear test site or missile launch site. This could be significant because that was added to the previous things. But it all depends on how you what you are ready to give North Korea in exchange with what you get. What you give is the measurement of how you think this is significant. And as for the end of the declaration, I want to point out that without giving North Korea what they want, it's meaningless. Do they really want the end of the declaration now? Right after the first summit meeting in Singapore, North Korea, I remember that North Korea talked a lot, but they are very quiet nowadays on this topic. So I do not think that this is the real thing that North Korea desperately want that. Rather, Kim Jong Un mentioned Kumgangsan and the Kaesong Industrial Complex in his New Year address. This is the only two specific things that Kim Jong Un specifically, spoke about in his New Year address. So probably these two things North Korea wants most at this juncture. And from my own experience with dealing with North Korea, I believe that North Korea, that these people are very material people. They do not believe in commitment. They do not believe in promise. They do not believe in language. They believe in materials, oil, cash, these things that actually comes into their territory. Giving something irreversible to the counterpart and get something reversible. This is the game they have been playing.
Well, it's interesting. I think it's entirely possible, at least seems to me, that President Trump is the one who wants the end of war declaration as something that he can sort of hold up there and say, the war is over, look, we ended it.
Right, and I think from the North Koreans' perspective, they've already won the war. I mean, all their museums are fatherland, liberation, victory monuments. So from the propaganda perspective, they got it. They've won that war. And so while they might have pushed for it in the beginning, I think it was, what's the point of asking for a peace declaration, early on in the summit? And it was to, I think, it was to try to bolster South Korea's demands for, or requests, or suggestions for a peace declaration to support President Moon's policy of wanting a permanent peace mechanism in place, or a permanent peace treaty in place. And two, it would be designed to erode the reasoning for the U.S. alliance with South Korea and with Japan, and U.S. troop presence in the region. So I think the peace declaration for North Korea is not significant in and of itself, but as a way of what that could mean down the line when they start building new asks or building new criticisms against what U.S. actions or South Korean actions that they might find objectionable.
Well, I'm curious to pick up on that and talk a little bit about a little further down the line. So I think we all agree that the United States alliance partnerships in the region with South Korea and Japan are essential to a good policy on North Korea. But these days, obviously, some of those ties seem a little strained. Underneath the surface, the U.S.-South Korea alliance under President Trump has seemed not exactly perfect from time to time. The relationship between Tokyo and Seoul right now seems like it is in quite undergoing some quite difficult times. So I'm curious for your thoughts on how you think those relationships will impact these ongoing negotiations, and of course, vice versa, if President Trump and Kim Jong Un strike some sort of deal in Hanoi or further out, how you think that will actually impact, again, these trilateral relationships in the region. Sujin, if you want to.
Well, as you mentioned, it's important for the alliance to be strengthened, not just to maintained. And we just recently had burden sharing negotiations, which came to conclusion.
United States and South Korea.
Yes, between the U.S. and the Republic of Korea. And fortunately, it came to a conclusion before the beginning of this summit, important summit. And there have been some because President Trump demanded 100% hike on the cost burden sharing, which was a tremendous hike for the time being. There was a lot of negotiations and some discord, so to speak, between the two allies. And I think there were concerns that that under President Trump, because he has mentioned the need for the troops to be stationed in Korea, and also that the fact that it's so costly to have them, he threw the idea of bringing them back, and it's too costly. So I think that gave the idea that the Korea-U.S. alliance, although it's a value-based alliance, it gave a nuance that it's maybe a monetary-based commercial relationship. So I think we need to make sure that these don't get in the way of our solid alliance to especially at this critical juncture, not to get in the way. And also, like you mentioned, Japan and South Korea and the U.S., trilateral cooperation is very much emphasized. But as we all know, the Korea-Japan relations are at their nadir at this moment. So once this, for now, it's bilateral summit between Trump and Kim, but once they come to a more concrete agreement on how to move forward, and I hope there will be a roadmap that is agreed, we definitely need to have other important players in the region, including Japan and China and also Russia, to actually enforce the implementation of the agreement and to have the peace mechanism as well sustainable. So multilateral, trilateral cooperation would be very, very important.
Yeah, my answer is very simple with regard to this alliance or the U.S.-Japan. From the top political leader to the working level, there are very close contact and consultation with regard to what's going to do with North Korea, including the upcoming summit meeting and the sanction-related issues. So, and even very recently, Mr. Abe, made a phone call to Mr. Trump to, talk about, the summit meeting. So probably, they had a very, substantive discussion over the phone, and Japan-Korea relations. I hope that this very difficult, the country difficult situation does not affect the cross consultation and communication with regard to the North Korean issue, because everybody would agree that Japan, Korea, and the United States share a lot with regard to North Korea issue. And this is what Mr. Chairman spoke minutes before, and this is why both the Senate and the House are now preparing a sort of statement to encourage,
right.
To promote the trilateral cooperation among these three stakeholders.
Okay. I think that is going to be a particularly important thing to watch as we move forward here. And I wanted to just throw the last two questions to you before opening it up for some questions from the audience. So first, human rights. We seem to talk about this issue far less when it comes to North Korea in the midst of this diplomacy. Obviously, this is one of the major concerns that the international community has with North Korea. It's, to Chairman Engel's point earlier, one of the reasons why there are significant sanctions, obviously, on North Korea. Those sanctions are tied to, some of them are tied directly to North Korea's human rights abuses. And then obviously the President of the United States meeting regularly with perhaps the world's most brutal dictator, and not only meeting with him, but praising him regularly. So I guess the question is, what role do you think that human rights should have in this summit diplomacy that the President is engaging in right now? Joan?
From my perspective, not raising human rights as part of this big summit and as part of North Korea policy is counterproductive. Let's put aside the moral imperative of human rights. But it really undercuts the administration's economic basket of goodies. The reason we have sanctions is that what the hundreds of millions of dollars that North Korea makes in coal, imports, iron ore, textiles, seafood, is that these funds are considered fungible, and that what they make in these would seem to be licit trade can easily be diverted to the weapons program. Not to mention the fact that that forced labor is a part of the revenue generation for the regime. So, but let's talk about the economic goodies. So President Trump keeps talking about all the bright economic future. He's no longer Kim Jong Un is no longer rocket man, but he's an economic rocket. So if we lift sanctions in exchange for what North Korea is doing, in the absence of human rights, improvements in human rights, how do we know that those sanctions, that the removal of sanctions and the money that is generated as a result of that doesn't go toward the the weapons program. So unless there's an opening, a concomitant opening of North Korea's, or loosening of North Korea's grip on its own people and its practices, I just don't see how you can square that circle of promising big economic things in exchange for denuclearization if you can't monitor where that money is going.
So Jun-Yu, I mean, in South Korea, it seems to me that President Moon is coming under some criticism for this as well, for sort of not focusing on this as much as he's focusing on the other issues.
Right. Human rights issues is very important, especially when it comes to North Korea, where it's the people are suffering from probably the worst human rights situation. So I think it is critical that we do address this issue and continue to press North Korea as is necessary. But what I think, from my understanding, the current administration in Seoul, President Moon, himself being a ex-human rights lawyer, recognizes that. But the understanding is that we cannot address everything all at once. So more pending issues, imminent issues first, like denuclearization. But I do agree that we need to include the human rights issues together. But when we look at even South Korea, just a generation ago, 30 years ago, South Korea just had its first direct vote elections with the democracy movement. And South Korea itself, a good ally of the United States, was a dictatorship. So I think we need to remember that as important as it is to continue to press North Korea and to demand improvement, progress, it's also important that we cannot expect North Korea to make those needed changes by just reprimanding, just forcing. So I think we need to move those along in a manageable pace, and also to enforce that along with some of the concessions or the reciprocal measures for that to be included. But I think at the moment the priority is on denuclearization.
Yeah, Japan has its own stake with regard to the human rights issue on issue of the Japanese citizens who were abducted by North Korea a decade before. And this is what one of the things that Mr. Abe stressed when he talked with Mr. Trump on the phone. And people expect that Mr. Trump will raise this again when he talks to Kim Jong Un in Hanoi. And as for the human rights issue in general, I believe that the United States should put this item on the table from the beginning when they talk to the North Korea. Not just because this issue is significant, but at the end of the day, any kind of arrangement could be agreed and ratified at the U.S. Senate or the Congress. And at that time, people would take a close look at the human rights situation in North Korea, and they might come up with new conditions on for the ratification of the deal made by the administration of the United States and North Korea. And at the time, if the U.S. first, comes up these human rights issues as a new condition to be addressed by North Korea, North Korean side would just assume that the United States moved the goalpost and make it a very good excuse for them to withdraw from what they have already committed or come up with their own new conditions. So as for the negotiation strategy, I believe that if you are not 100% confident that the human rights issue would not be taken care by your own domestic audience, you should put this item on the table for the beginning. Of course, it depends on the how and when this issue should be dealt with vis-a-vis North Korea. But you need to let North Korea know that this is the thing you have to take care of. But what's difficult about the human rights situation, human rights issue, is how to specify, how to define the actions North Korea should take. you can talk in a very general term that this human rights issue is important and you should take care of that. Return of for example, the abducted citizens, not foreign citizens, that is relatively specific. But what else? So actually, in trying to address these human rights issues in North Korea, we also need to seriously consider what specific action we need North Korea to take.
Those actions are already listed in one of the appendices of the UN Commission of Inquiry published in 2014. We're celebrating the 5 years since then, and they include things like don't jail children of people who are accused of alleged crimes. Do not do forced abortions of women who are in these prisons. So, I mean, there are things that have already, let's not try to recreate the wheel, but that this is already done. And I think those are some things that hopefully it's not too late to raise this far into the process.
So I wanted to just leave a couple of minutes to take maybe one round of questions from the audience. And as we're getting the microphone ready for that, very quickly, just want to go through the panel. This would not be a preview event without predictions for what you think is going to happen at the summit this week. So very quickly, in just a couple of words or sentences, what you think the major outcome for the summit will be this week. Tai?
So, dismantle of some part of our Yongbyon facilities and, return by IAEA inspectors and some corresponding measures by the United States and probably the roadmap, task force.
All right. Sujin?
Well, in addition to what he said, a declaration of peace or something that says that the war is over. Yes.
I see something, I'll go more general. I see something that's whipped up into a froth, and that when it starts to, fizzle out, you see nothing but a little bit of hot chocolate at the bottom.
All right, that's a good image to leave the audience with. All right, so maybe we just take one round of 2 or 3 questions and then take them all together before we wrap up. If we have any press in the audience as well, please let us know. Yes, please go ahead first.
Hi, I'm Dee Parvaz with Think Progress, and my question is this. What do you think the chances are that Kim Jong Un is simply buying time with all of these talks? Because as all this is happening, North Korea is still amassing fissile material. So it's really easy for him to have these talks and to come up with these agreements, but not really do anything.
Just take a couple of more right here first, and then we'll answer them all together.
Tim Shorrock, I'm with The Nation magazine. There's an issue involving Okinawa that involves Korea. Yesterday, there was 70% of the people in Okinawa voted no to Henoko, the expansion of the base there. That base is being built to replace Futenma. About a year ago, former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry said in a speech that Futenma could very well close if there was a true peace agreement in Korea, because U.S. Marines in Futenma are designed to go into Korea to stop North Korea from getting to Seoul in case of a war. How can we, as the United States, lecture other countries about Korea, about human rights, when we don't even listen to the people of Okinawa? Abe has already said he's going to go ahead with this base. And, couldn't there be like a more deeper move to, involve Japan and in a way that would, remove the base's impact on Okinawa and also keep the peace in Korea?
Great. I know we've only got 1 minute left, so maybe I'll just take those 2 and we'll go around for final thoughts with those questions. Todd, do you want to start? I don't know if you can answer the Okinawa question too.
2 of them?
Yes, each of them.
Okay,
please.
yeah.
Let's go.
So as for the Kim Jong Un's intent, my personal view is that he is not doing this just to buy time. One proof is that he started this charm offensive process at the very early period of the presidency of both South Korea and the United States, which means that he is not just trying to hit and run. He rather would like to make some deal, with the president of the United States as well as the president of the South Korea. Of course, you may assume that he is serious to cheat. But no doubt, he is serious. And this is the one thing, like I said. And as for the Okinawa, the Futenma Air Base and the relocation of it is in part to reduce the burden of Okinawa and in part to reduce the risk the current Futenma Air Base is posing on the surrounding area. And of course, the necessity of keeping U.S. Marine base in Okinawa is to take care of the security situation in not just about the Korean Peninsula, but entire Northeast Asia. So as far as the entire security environment in that this region is there, if it doesn't change, probably the strategic significance of Okinawa would remain as it is. And of course, if we really see the achievement of any sort of a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, that could affect any sort of entire the military posture, not only on Japan, but throughout the region. But it is still far away from here.
As to whether Kim Jong Un is trying to buy time, I don't know. But I think it's important to test if he is. And my understanding is that he is serious, as Tai just said, because he has announced this 5-year economic plan strategy, which will come to its final year next year. And next year is the 75th anniversary of North Korea's Workers' Party. And those two things coincide next year, which means that because he said he would develop his economy, time is not necessarily on his side. He needs to produce results to show to his people that he really indeed has made changes to improve the economy and to see the visible changes in the livelihoods of its people. So I don't think, although I may be wrong, I think we'll have to test, but I think he is serious in that he does want to strike a deal and improve the economy so that his long-term rule can be secured.
I'm in agreement with the other panelists, but I'd also add that he's probably not going to get it any better than the situation he has now, with a U.S. president who is very eager to meet with him and to see if they can make a deal together, plus a progressive president in South Korea who wants something to happen, plus a Japan that's sidelined, plus a China and Russia that wants sanctions removed and is on North Korea's side. So this is a confluence of situations that are highly favorable to Kim. His biggest vulnerability is his people, and two, the fact that he is dependent on trade with China, which now accounts for 94% of North Korea's trade. So that's going to make him deeply, deeply uncomfortable.
With that, we'll close out the panel. Thank you very much to our panelists. Please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists, and thank you all for joining us.